I'm Lieutenant General Elise Maddox, 48 years old, and they thought I was just there to fill a seat. To my family, I was an awkward, uniformed anomaly. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the man my sister Claire was about to marry owed me his very life, a debt forged in the dust and fire of Helmand. But at that polished mahogany table, surrounded by the chilly air of Boston's elite, my mother smiled as Claire raised her glass. "My big sister is a lieutenant general," she chirped, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure she's very busy managing all that important paperwork at the Pentagon." The table erupted in polite, cutting laughter. My hand didn't tremble. My breath didn't catch. They saw a clerk. I saw a tactical error. Have you ever been reduced to a caricature by the people who should know you best? They thought they were telling a joke. They were actually declaring war. Follow along to see how a paper pusher teaches a masterclass in power. The joke, of course, had started weeks earlier. It arrived not as a punchline, but as a heavy, cream-colored envelope lying on my immaculate desk at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Outside, the persistent Washington drizzle tapped against the window, a familiar, steady rhythm in a life defined by order. But the invitation was a disruption. It was ostentatious and impersonal, the thick cardstock embossed with the golden Maddox family crest, a detail they never forgot. My name, Lieutenant General Elise Maddox, was printed in elegant script, but it felt like a clerical entry, a name copied from a government database, rather than written from the heart. 6 years. That's how long the silence had lasted. 6 years since my father's funeral. Not a single call on Christmas. Not a text message after an IED blast in Fallujah. It had nearly cost me my hearing. Just a vast, punishing emptiness. So this invitation wasn't an olive branch, it was a summons, a formal command to appear and play my role as the dutiful older sister in their flawless production. 6 years of silence, and this was their first transmission. Not a question of how I was, but a demand that I show up. Was this an invitation or a subpoena? Master Sergeant Grant entered without knocking, a privilege earned over 15 years in places where politeness was a liability. He placed a mug of black coffee on my desk. His eyes flickered to the invitation, then back to my face. "It's them again, isn't it, General?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I said nothing, just nudged the envelope toward him. He picked it up, his gaze narrowing as he read the groom's name. "Vance, Ethan Vance, the kid from Helmand, the one you pulled out of hell." He set it down, his expression unreadable, but his meaning clear. So he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Are you going to a wedding, or are you deploying to a new theater of war?" I stared out at the gray, misty landscape. He understood my silence. "Go," he said, his tone firm. "But don't wear those stars on your shoulder like armor. Wear them like a legacy. Let them remember exactly who you became without them." On the Alaska Airlines flight from Seattle to Boston, I paid extra for a first-class seat. Not for the luxury, but for the privacy. I needed the space to breathe, to brace myself. My phone vibrated against the armrest. The screen lit up with Claire's name. I took a deep, steadying breath before answering. "Elise," my sister's voice chimed, bright and brittle as a silver bell. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't planning on wearing that uniform to the wedding. It's just a bit much. This is Boston, you know, not Fort Bragg. I'm just worried people won't know what to say." Every word was coated in sugar, but the core was cold steel. The condescension was so effortless, so practiced. I gripped the leather armrest, its coolness a stark contrast to the heat rising in my chest. I'll take it under consideration, I replied, my voice mechanically even. I ended the call before she could say another word. The battle had begun at 35,000 feet. They didn't want my presence. They wanted a sanitized, approved version of me. The taxi dropped me in front of the familiar brownstone on Beacon Hill, with its antique gas lamps and brick sidewalks. Nothing had changed. It was still stately, still imposing, and still achingly cold. My mother, Catherine Maddox, opened the door. She was flawless in a beige cashmere dress, a string of perfect pearls at her throat. She didn't hug me. She didn't even offer a real smile. Her eyes swept over me, a quick, dismissive appraisal that ended on my ramrod-straight military posture. "Elise, come in," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I trust you'll be on your best behavior. Let's not ruin Claire's big day." It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. My chest tightened, a familiar sensation, like a block of ice settling in my lungs. I wasn't a daughter returning home after 6 years. I was a risk to be managed, a potential threat to their picture-perfect world. Her words hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. It wasn't a new wound. It was just the echo of an old one, stretching all the way back to a childhood spent trying to be seen. In the living room, my mother paused to admire a silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of Claire and me as teenagers. Claire was radiant, a genuine smile lighting up her face. I was standing slightly behind her, my own smile a tight, practiced line. Seeing that photo, the years collapsed. The polite, cutting dismissal I had just received at the door was not an isolated incident. It was the final entry in a long, detailed ledger of insignificance. I was 17, and my senior prom was approaching. The air in our Beacon Hill home was thick with excitement, but none of it was for me. It was for Claire, then 15, who was being fitted for her debutante ball gown. I watched as my mother fussed over her, her voice a soft coo of admiration. "My darling, you look like a princess," she said, smoothing the seafoam green silk of the Oscar de la Renta creation. Claire twirled, a vision of youthful grace. I cleared my throat, my own upcoming milestone feeling small and clumsy in comparison. "Mother, about my prom dress," I began. She turned, her adoring expression fading into one of cool assessment. "Elise, you're the strong one. You don't need all that fuss," she said, as if it were a compliment. "Use your savings, or find something simple at Feline's basement." The words didn't just deny me a dress. They denied me the right to feel beautiful, to be celebrated. They defined me as practical, not precious. So I bought a bolt of discounted navy blue fabric and sewed my own dress. At the pre-prom reception, my mother introduced me to her friends with a proud, patronizing air. "This is Elise. She's so wonderfully practical, never demanding." They all nodded, praising my sensible nature, while I stood there in my homemade dress, feeling like a handmaiden next to the princess they all adored. The praise was the most sophisticated form of contempt. That pattern of dismissal followed me to the day I left for West Point. It was a bright, crisp Boston morning at Logan Airport. My family was there to see me off, but they weren't truly with me. All their attention, all their pride, was focused on Claire, who had just won a city-wide piano competition. My mother was holding court, recounting every triumphant note of Claire's performance to anyone who would listen. She spoke of Claire's future at Juilliard, of a brilliant artistic career. I stood to the side, invisible in my plain civilian clothes, my heavy duffel bag a silent testament to the different path I had chosen. When it was time for me to go through security, My mother just turned briefly. Her story about Claire momentarily paused. "Be safe and try not to get into any trouble," she said, then immediately turned back to her audience. It was only my father, a retired Army colonel, who pulled me aside. He enveloped me in a hug, the familiar scent of his Old Spice, a comforting anchor. He whispered in my ear, his voice rough with emotion, "Don't you listen to any of them. You were born for this. Make me proud." It was the only validation I received that day, a single sturdy life raft in an ocean of indifference. It was then, while reading an article about General Annie Dunwoody becoming the first female four-star general, that I found a flicker of hope. If she could rise to the top, maybe I could too, despite it all. 6 years ago, that hope felt like a distant memory. I stood at Arlington National Cemetery, the mournful notes of taps cutting through the gray, somber air. The honor guard folded the American flag with meticulous precision and presented it to my mother. My father, Colonel Richard Maddox, was being laid to rest with every honor he had earned. I stood tall in my brigadier general's uniform, my grief a sharp, disciplined ache in my chest. But when I looked at the front row reserved for family, there was only my mother and Claire. They had left an empty chair between them, a deliberate, chilling void that screamed my exclusion. After the ceremony, I approached my mother, wanting to offer comfort. She looked up at me, her eyes dry and hard. "You shouldn't have worn the uniform, Elise," she said, her voice like a razor. "It looks like you're showing off, flaunting your power at your own father's funeral. He wouldn't have liked it." That was the final, precise stab. They had weaponized my father's legacy against me, turning the very thing he was proudest of into a source of shame. And now, tonight, the echo of that shaming returned. Back in the present, at the formal pre-wedding dinner, the same script played out on a grander stage. The table was laden with expensive dishes, seared scallops, beef Wellington, served on my mother's finest Wedgwood china. My mother was introducing me to one of my father's old business partners, a powerful investor from New York. "This is my eldest, Elise. She works for the government in Washington." The man was polite. "How impressive! You must hold an important position." Before I could answer, Claire leaned in, her smile sweet, her eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, she's mostly in administration," she said breezily. "She's very good with paperwork, probably keeping the seats warm at the Pentagon." A ripple of polite laughter went around the table. I said nothing. I just picked up my knife and fork and cut into my steak. The prime beef, which should have melted in my mouth, tasted like ash. After all these years, the humiliation still tasted exactly the same. My father had told me to be proud. But how could I be proud of something my own family treated as a source of shame? What was the point of all this strength if I couldn't even carve out a space for myself? I had to do something. But what? Claire's jibe about paperwork echoed in my mind, a fresh sting on an old wound. She had no idea what my paperwork consisted of. After-action reports detailing the loss of young soldiers, signed deployment orders that sent thousands into harm's way, condolence letters that I wrote by hand until my fingers ached. My entire career had been forged in the crucible of consequence, a world away from her debutante balls and charity luncheons. The answer to my question was not in Boston. It was in the path I had already walked alone. My memories of West Point aren't of the grand Gothic stone buildings or the crisp, formal parades. My memories are of the soul-crushing exhaustion of beast barracks, the freezing mud that seemed to seep into my bones during field training, and the gnawing loneliness of being one of the few women in my company. I had to work twice as hard to be considered half as good. I remember a tactics professor, an old school colonel, stating flatly in front of the entire class, "The battlefield is no place for emotion, which is why it's no place for female leadership." While Claire was at home, attending dance classes and parties, I was learning to field strip an M16 in the dark, my fingers numb with cold. I was learning to read topographical maps and to command with a voice that betrayed no fear, even when I was terrified. The few letters my mother sent were filled with breathless updates of Claire's latest accomplishments, with only a single, perfunctory line for me: "Do take care of yourself." It wasn't a request, it was a directive, as impersonal as a line item on a budget. The desert forged what was left of me into steel. The National Training Center in the Mojave is where young officers are broken or made. As a young captain, I was there commanding an armored company in a simulated combat rotation. It was 120 degrees in the shade, with relentless sand and a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical illness. During a critical night offensive, our communications systems went down. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. But I remembered my father's words: "When technology fails, trust your people." I used signal flares and runners, actual soldiers running messages between tanks, to coordinate the assault. We took our objective, but it was messy and costly. After the exercise, a senior evaluating officer, a battle-hardened general, pulled me aside. "You've got your father's grit, Maddox," he said, his voice gravelly. It was the highest praise I had ever received. But when I called home, excited to share the news, my mother's only response was, "That sounds terribly dangerous. Why can't you find a safer job, something behind a desk?" She didn't hear courage. She only heard a foolish choice. The road to the Pentagon wasn't paved with glory. It was paved with 16-hour days, cold takeout eaten at my desk, and a string of failed relationships. I chose duty over dinner dates, mission readiness over personal milestones. I missed my best friend's wedding. I missed birthdays and holidays. My social circle slowly shrank until it consisted almost exclusively of other people in uniform. While Claire was marrying her first husband, an investment banker, and moving into a sprawling mansion in a Connecticut suburb, I was in a windowless briefing room arguing troop allocation strategies for combat zones. Every time I saw a photo of her perfect family on social media, the smiling children, the golden retriever, the summer vacations in the Hamptons, a bitter ache would settle in my chest. It wasn't envy. It was the sting of knowing that my family viewed my sacrifice as my failure, as proof that I was incapable of having a normal life. They couldn't understand that for me, service was life. The day I was promoted to Brigadier General should have been one of my proudest. I invited my family to the ceremony in Washington, D.C. Only my father came. My mother and Claire were busy with a charity auction. My dad stood there, his hands trembling slightly with age and pride, as he pinned the first star to my shoulder. "I knew you had it in you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, he took me to an old steakhouse he loved, and he gave me a small worn box. Inside was his own compass from Vietnam. "Never lose your bearings, Elise," he told me, "not even when the people you love try to make you lose your way." A few months later, he was gone. And at his funeral, in her eulogy, my mother never once mentioned my career. It was as if the most important part of my life, the legacy my father was so fiercely proud of, had been erased. After that empty dinner in Boston, sitting alone in my car, I finally understood. I couldn't wait for their approval. I had to build a life so strong, so undeniably my own, that their opinion no longer mattered. But that night, understanding wasn't enough. The air inside my rental car felt as suffocating as the atmosphere in my mother's dining room. Thick with unspoken judgment and feigned politeness, I had to get out. I started the car and just drove with no destination in mind, escaping the perfectly manicured prison of Beacon Hill. The historic streets of Boston blurred past, the gas lamps smearing through a film of tears I refused to let fall. On my car's audio system, I had a podcast playing, a sermon by T.D. Jakes. I wasn't a particularly religious person, but his powerful voice, talking about finding purpose in your pain, was a steadying presence in the chaos of my thoughts. Finally, I pulled over in front of a small, historic-looking pub called the Green Dragon Tavern. Its old brick facade and the scent of ale spilling out onto the cobblestone street felt real, unpretentious. I just wanted to be in a place where no one knew my name, where I wasn't a daughter who had failed or a general who didn't belong. I found a dark corner booth, the worn leather cool against my back, and ordered a bourbon, neat. I stared into the amber liquid, the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation a welcome shield. In that moment, I felt more alone than I ever had in a war zone. I was a general with no army, a daughter with no family. The particular pain of being ostracized by your own blood is a wound that no uniform, no matter how decorated, can ever cover. General Maddox. A familiar voice cut through my solitude. I looked up, startled. Standing there was David Chen, a former intelligence officer who had served under my command in Iraq. He had since left the army and was now a lawyer in Boston. He looked older, more settled, but his eyes had the same sharp intelligence I remembered. "I can't believe it's you," he said, a genuine warm smile spreading across his face. He slid into the booth opposite me without waiting for an invitation. He took one look at my face and said, his voice direct but kind, "You don't look okay." I was taken aback by his frankness. I could only manage a slight nod. Instead of prying with questions, he simply signaled the bartender. "I'm not going to ask," he said, as another glass of bourbon was placed before him. "But if you need someone to just sit in silence with, I'm here." His silence was a world away from my family's. His was a silence of respect, of shared understanding. Theirs was a silence of judgment, of punishment. We talked for hours. I never mentioned my family. I spoke of the challenges at the Pentagon, the weight of command, the strange transition back to life in the States. He listened, truly listened, nodding in all the right places, understanding the unspoken language of service. The weight in my chest began to lift, ever so slightly. As the bars started to thin out, he looked at his watch. "My wife Maria is a huge admirer of yours," he said. "She was Navy. We're about to grab a late dinner at a little Italian place in the North End. Would you join us?" I hesitated. The thought of more social interaction was exhausting, but the sincerity in his eyes, the simple offer of inclusion, made me agree. At the restaurant, a cozy place filled with the smell of garlic and oregano, a woman with a warm, welcoming face rushed forward and gave me a firm, heartfelt hug. "It's an honor to finally meet you, General," Maria said. "David never shuts up about how you saved his team's bacon more than once." Their 2 kids, a boy and a girl, were a whirlwind of chaotic, happy energy. They argued over who got the last breadstick and spilled a little bit of soda, and their parents handled it all with a gentle, loving patience that felt foreign to me. Throughout the meal, a noisy, wonderful affair with plates of chicken parmigiana and spaghetti passed around the table, they asked me about my career. Not about the politics or the danger, but about leadership, about the places I'd seen, the people I'd met. They looked at me with genuine admiration. When their 8-year-old son, Leo, asked with wide-eyed awe, "Are you a superhero?" Maria just laughed and ruffled his hair. "Close enough, kiddo. She's the real deal." For the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt valued. Not by people who were obligated to love me, but by strangers who chose to respect me. When they dropped me off at my hotel, David pressed his business card into my hand. "Elise," he said, using my first name for the first time, his tone serious. "You're not alone in this city. There's a whole network of us, vets who look out for each other. It's the buddy system. It never really ends. If you need anything, a lawyer, a friend, or just a place to have coffee and sit in silence, you call me, anytime." That offer, that recognition of another kind of family, a tribe forged not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual respect, finally broke through the ice that had encased my heart. Back in the solitude of my hotel room, I finally let the tears come. But they weren't tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of gratitude. I realized that family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you fight alongside. That night, for the first time, I no longer felt like a solitary general. I was part of an invisible platoon. The warmth of that realization stayed with me through the night, a fragile shield against a lifetime of coldness. But hope, I've learned, can be a dangerous thing. It makes you vulnerable. The next morning, as I was savoring a cup of coffee and the rare feeling of peace, my phone rang. It was my mother. The immediate shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The warmth from the previous night evaporated, replaced by a familiar, chilling dread. Her voice, when I answered, was unusually sweet, a syrupy tone she reserved for strategic apologies. "Elise, darling, I know I was a bit tense yesterday. It's just all the stress with Claire's wedding." She paused, a calculated beat for me to absorb her feigned remorse. I remained silent. My silence had always been a weapon she couldn't counter. "I have a small favor to ask," she continued, getting to the point. "Ethan's father, Mr. Vance, is a major defense contractor. He's heard so much about you and is just dying to meet you. I thought we could have an intimate family lunch at the club. It would be so good for family relations, you know." I knew instantly. This wasn't an invitation, it was a transaction. They wanted to leverage my rank, to use my stars to impress a business associate. The fragile peace I had felt just moments before shattered, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of being used. They only called when they needed something. I wasn't a daughter, I was an asset. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A part of me was morbidly curious to see the play unfold, while another, foolish part of me still clung to a sliver of duty. The country club in Brookline was another world, a universe of manicured lawns, quiet wealth, and unspoken rules. Men in pastel polo shirts and khaki pants discussed stock portfolios, while women with blinding diamond bracelets made small talk. My mother and Claire were already there, their smiles bright and brittle. Mr. Vance was a large man with a politician's handshake and an appraising gaze that missed nothing. Throughout the lunch, my mother became my unofficial publicist. "My daughter, the general," she would say, launching into exaggerated tales of my achievements, stories she'd never cared to listen to before. Claire, a master of subtle manipulation, deftly steered the conversation towards the lucrative defense contracts Mr. Vance's company was bidding on. I sat there eating my lobster salad, feeling like a prized racehorse being trotted out for a potential buyer. They weren't introducing Elise Maddox, their daughter, their sister. They were showcasing Lieutenant General Maddox, a valuable commodity. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling star. After lunch, once Mr. Vance had departed, presumably impressed, my mother guided me to a private lounge overlooking the 18th hole. Her demeanor shifted from charming hostess to concerned matriarch. "Elise, there's a delicate matter," she said, her voice low and serious. "The Vance family is insisting Claire sign a rather unfavorable prenuptial agreement. They're underestimating our family, our standing." She handed me a thick legal document. The air left my lungs. "I want you to speak to Ethan," she said, her eyes boring into mine. "As his former commanding officer, you have influence over him. You need to tell him that this is disrespectful, that it could be seen as a slight against a high-ranking officer's family, and that could affect his reputation in the military." I was speechless. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't just using my rank for social currency, they were demanding I use it as a weapon in their financial negotiations. It was unethical, an abuse of power that could destroy both my career and Ethan's. Claire, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her blue eyes welling up with perfectly formed, strategic tears. "Please, Elise," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll listen to you. You're my only hope." The performance was flawless. The loving mother and the desperate sister united against the cold, unfeeling world. They had pushed me past every boundary of decency and honor. They had finally reached my limit. In that quiet, opulent room, something inside me shifted. The years of hurt and resignation solidified into a cold, clear anger. I looked at my mother's expectant face, then at my sister's tear-streaked one. A line from Sun Tzu's The Art of War surfaced in my mind. "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." I finally knew my enemy. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it resonated with an authority they had never heard from me before. My mother's smile faltered. "What did you say?" "I said no," I repeated, my gaze unwavering. "I will not abuse my authority for this family's financial gain, and I will not allow either of you to use me as a pawn in your games any longer." Claire's manufactured tears vanished, replaced by a flash of pure venom. "You're so selfish," she spat. "It's always about you, isn't it?" My mother's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "If you won't help your own family, Elise, then don't consider yourself a part of it." I met her gaze without flinching. "Ma'am," I said, using the formal term of address for the first time, a word that was both respectful and distancing. "I haven't been considered a part of this family for a very long time." I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving them in a stunned, uncomprehending silence. The drive back to the hotel was a blur. I didn't register the traffic or the city lights. There was only a cold, hard knot in my stomach, and the echo of my mother's final threat. I had drawn a line in the sand, and I knew they wouldn't just let it be. The moment I walked into my hotel room, the phone began to ring. A shrill, insistent demand. I knew it was Claire. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it ring until it died. But another part, the strategist, knew I needed to hear the enemy's next move. I answered. "What did you do?" Her voice wasn't the sweet, lilting soprano she used in public. It was a low, vicious hiss. "You've ruined everything. Ethan is hesitating now. He said you were right." I held the phone away from my ear, the venom in her tone almost palpable. I said nothing. My silence seemed to infuriate her more. "If you don't fix this," her voice dropped into a clear, chilling threat. "I swear I will make you regret it. You think you're so perfect, so untouchable in that uniform? I know there are stories in the military. I'll make sure everyone knows you're not the saint you pretend to be." A shudder went through me, but it wasn't fear. It was a profound, icy rage. Hey, my own sister, my blood, was threatening to destroy the career I had spent my entire life building, all over a prenuptial agreement. It was the final straw. The dam of a lifetime of suppressed anger didn't just crack, it shattered. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with another call. It was David Chen. I ended the call with Claire and answered, my hand trembling slightly. "Elise, I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice grim, "but I just heard something that you need to know." I braced myself. A friend of mine at the Pentagon, in the Inspector General's office, did some digging after we talked. He found an old anonymous complaint filed against you a few years back. It alleged that you bent the rules for a promotion. My blood ran cold. It wasn't substantiated, not enough evidence for a formal investigation, but it was enough to put your file on a hold status. It delayed your promotion to Lieutenant General for nearly a year. My mind raced, flashing back to that frustrating, inexplicable period of stagnation. That was why. "Elise," David continued, his voice hesitant. "The complaint had some very specific grammatical errors, and it mentioned details about your family dynamics that only an insider would know. It was a direct hit. The air was knocked from my lungs. Claire, it had to be Claire. The timing, the specificity, the sheer malice of it all. She had tried to sabotage me from the shadows years ago. This wasn't a new tactic, it was an escalation. This betrayal was more intimate, more painful than any physical wound I had ever sustained on the battlefield. I hung up the phone, the silence of the room roaring in my ears. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I saw the face of a lieutenant general in the United States Army, a woman who had commanded thousands. I saw the fine lines around my eyes, each one a map of sleepless nights and life or death decisions. But beneath the authority, I saw a deep, profound exhaustion, a lifetime of being diminished, of being told I was too much and not enough at the same time. They had taken my childhood, my youth. Now they were coming for my honor. No, not again. A quote from Theodore Roosevelt, one my father used to repeat, slammed into my mind. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." I had been in the arena my entire life. I had faced down enemies with guns and bombs. I would not be taken down by whispers and threats from the cheap seats. I leaned closer to the mirror, my own eyes staring back, hard and unflinching. "You are done being silent," I said to the woman in the reflection. "You are done enduring. You fought for your country. Now you fight for yourself." In that instant, a lifetime of defensive maneuvering ended. A cold, hard, strategic clarity took its place. I would not just defend, I would attack. I would go to that wedding, not as the scorned older sister, but as a commanding officer arriving to inspect her troops. I walked out of the bathroom, my movements now precise and purposeful. I picked up my phone and dialed Master Sergeant Grant in Washington. He answered on the first ring. "Grant," I said, my voice sharp and clear, all traces of emotion gone. "I have a new set of orders. First, I need my Class A, Army service uniform, full decorations, overnighted to my hotel. Use the fastest courier available. Second, pull the complete service record for Major Ethan Vance, with a specific focus on the after-action report from the Helmand operation, where I was the ground commander. And third, I want a manifest of every single one of my awarded medals and citations. I want them polished and ready. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a single, resolute reply. "Roger that, General. Consider it done." He didn't ask why. He knew. The battle had been officially declared, and I had just called in my first wave of reinforcements. They wanted to treat me like a gatekeeper. Fine. I would show them who held the keys to the kingdom. My hotel room transformed from a place of refuge into a tactical operations center. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind the cold, clear focus of a commander before an engagement. I remembered a quote from Eisenhower I'd read years ago. "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." The plan could change, but the process of planning, of assessing the terrain, knowing my assets and understanding the enemy, that was where I would find my strength. My laptop was open, files and documents arranged in neat, orderly stacks on the desk. I was no longer a wounded guest. I was a general preparing for an operation. The package from Grant arrived via FedEx same-day service before noon. Inside, my Class A Army service uniform was perfectly pressed, the dark blue jacket radiating authority. Beside it, nestled in a velvet-lined box, were my decorations. I carefully laid each one out on the crisp white hotel bedspread, a silent inventory of a life they had dismissed. The Silver Star for gallantry in action, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with a V for valor. Each piece of polished metal was a chapter of my story, a testament to a sacrifice they had willfully ignored. Looking at them now, they were no longer just mementos, they were munitions. They were the tangible, undeniable proof of who I was, and they were the truth my family was about to confront. I picked up the Silver Star, its weight familiar in my hand. It wasn't just a medal, it was the memory of shrapnel tearing through the air, of the taste of dust and fear, and of a choice I made when others hesitated. This was the history they had tried to erase, and I was about to make it impossible to ignore. Next, I opened the encrypted file Grant had sent, containing the after-action report from the Helmand Province operation. The dry, bureaucratic language of the military document did little to soften the raw horror of that day. I read the details again, my focus absolute, the ambush, the IED, the building collapse. I could still hear the desperate calls over the radio, the raw panic in the young soldiers' voices as they reported Major Ethan Vance was trapped, his leg crushed under a steel beam, bleeding out. I remembered the direct order from headquarters, stand down and wait for air support, but I knew waiting was a death sentence. I recalled the decision, made in a split second, to lead a small fire team across open ground under heavy enemy fire. I remembered the grit of concrete dust in my teeth as I helped pull him from the rubble, moments before the rest of the structure gave way. The report's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Then Brigadier General Maddox's decisive action, in direct contravention of a stand-down order, but in response to the exigent circumstances, directly resulted in the saving of Major Vance's life at extreme personal risk. This wasn't my version of the story. This was the United States Army's official record. This was my ultimate weapon, and it was about to be deployed. With my own assets accounted for, I needed to probe the position of my potential and most pivotal ally. I dialed Ethan's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense. "General." "Major," I began, my tone all business, professional, and cool. I'm calling to confirm my attendance at your ceremony tomorrow. There was a strained silence on the other end. General, I am so sorry for what happened, for what Claire and her mother. I'm not calling about that, Major. I cut him off cleanly. I am calling to remind you of the concepts of loyalty and honor. They are the bedrock of an officer's commission. I trust you haven't forgotten them. I wasn't threatening him. I was reminding him of who he was. I was planting a seed of conflict in his mind, forcing him to weigh his loyalties. He owed me his life, yet he was about to swear his life to a woman who wanted to destroy mine. I wanted that paradox to sit with him, to force a choice before the moment of crisis. The call ended. I had positioned my final piece on the chessboard. On the morning of the wedding, I didn't fuss with my hair or makeup. My hair was pulled back into a tight regulation bun. My face was clean, my expression neutral. Then, methodically, I began to dress. The crisp white shirt, the black tie, the perfectly tailored dark blue jacket. One by one, I pinned my decorations to my chest, each in its precise order of precedence, the silver star taking the highest position of honor. When I finally stood before the full-length mirror, the woman staring back was not the weary, wounded person who had arrived in Boston a few days earlier. It was a lieutenant general of the United States Army. This uniform wasn't an outfit. It was my armor, forged in sweat, blood, and sacrifice. It was the symbol of everything I had fought for, everything I had become. Today, I was not attending a wedding. I was conducting an inspection, and I would tolerate no disrespect for this uniform or for the woman wearing it. The reception was being held in the grand ballroom of the Liberty Hotel. The irony was not lost on me. A wedding in a building that was once the Charles Street Jail, a place of confinement. Tonight, its soaring rotunda and wrought iron accents felt less like history and more like a metaphor for my own life. As I stepped into the ballroom, a hush fell over the room. The string quartet seemed to falter mid-note. The polite chatter of Boston's elite died down to a murmur. Every head turned. My Class A Army service uniform, the dark blue jacket adorned with 2 rows of gleaming ribbons and medals, was a stark, disciplined presence in a sea of silk gowns and black tuxedos. It was an intrusion of reality into their carefully curated world. I saw my mother's face first. Her polite hostess smile froze, the color draining from her cheeks. I saw Claire, radiant in her Vera Wang gown, her expression of triumph curdling into disbelief. Their seating chart had placed me at a small table in the far back corner, next to a service door, a position of deliberate obscurity. A wry smile touched my lips. They had given me the perfect tactical position, an unobstructed view of the entire operational area with a clear line of egress. But they had miscalculated. I wasn't there to retreat. I was there to advance. I walked calmly to my assigned table, my posture erect, my steps measured. I sat down, placed my hands in my lap, and I waited. My mere presence was a statement. The entire room felt it. A palpable tension now lay beneath the surface of the celebration, a quiet hum of anticipation. I was a loaded weapon placed on a banquet table, and they were all wondering when I would go off. The moment came during the toasts. After the best man's rambling speech, Claire took the stage, a vision of bridal perfection. She raised her crystal flute of champagne. After a few breathless thank yous, her eyes, glittering with malice, found mine across the room. And I especially want to thank my sister, Elise, for being here today, she began, her voice dangerously sweet. I know how busy she is with all her paperwork at the Pentagon, but she still made time for us. Let's all raise a glass to the quiet gatekeeper of our family." A few confused, polite chuckles rippled through the room. Most guests simply looked uncomfortable, sensing the barb beneath the pretty words. My mother, seated at the head table, leaned into a nearby microphone. "She's always been the family's little embarrassment," she added, her voice carrying across the silent room. But at least she was on time for once. That was it, the final volley. They had declared war on an open channel, in front of their entire army of socialites and power brokers. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The room went dead silent, and every eye was on me. And in that frozen moment, the unexpected happened. Ethan Vance, the groom, who had been standing on stage with a pained, miserable expression, suddenly set his champagne flute down with a decisive click. Without a glance at his bride or his mother-in-law, he stepped off the stage. He walked with purpose, his steps echoing in the cavernous, silent ballroom. He navigated through the maze of opulent tables, his eyes locked on mine. The entire room tracked his movement as if he were a heat-seeking missile. He stopped directly in front of me. He didn't speak. He simply came to attention, his back ramrod straight, and executed a sharp, perfect military salute. The kind a soldier gives to a commanding officer they deeply respect. The last few whispers in the room died. Then he turned to face the stunned audience, still holding the salute, his voice ringing with an authority no one in that room, least of all my family, had ever heard from him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and strong, "please forgive my wife's lack of information." He paused, letting the words sink in, a grenade with the pin pulled. He still held his salute, a powerful public display of allegiance. His eyes swept the room, finally landing on my mother and the head table, where Claire was now staring, mouth agape. "The woman you just heard mocked," he continued, his voice hardening, "is not a paper pusher. She is not a gatekeeper." He took a deep, steadying breath. "This is Lieutenant General Elise Maddox of the United States Army." A collective gasp, a soft whoosh of shock went through the room. Forks clattered onto plates. "She is not just a high-ranking officer." Ethan's voice grew louder, each word a hammer blow to my family's fabricated narrative. "She is the commanding officer who, 6 years ago in Helmand, personally saved my life." The revelation detonated in the center of the ballroom. You could see the mental calculations on every face, the reevaluation, the dawning horror. This was the woman they had just laughed at. This was the embarrassment. Ethan finally lowered his hand, but his gaze remained fixed on my mother. "And as an officer and as a man," he said, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, "I will not stand by while her honor is insulted." The aftermath was swift and brutal. Claire's face went from shock to a ghastly white. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed in a heap of expensive Vera Wang silk. My mother shot up from her chair, knocking over her champagne glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. "Elise," she began, but the name came out as a strangled gasp. The chessboard had been flipped, the game was over, and the most powerful move had been made without me having to say a single word. The aftermath was a strange cocktail of chaos and silence. As paramedics attended to the heap of white silk that was my sister, the grand ballroom of the Liberty Hotel held its collective breath. The guests, once a sea of confident chatter, were now a scattered collection of awkward, averted gazes. No one looked directly at me, yet I could feel the weight of every eye. I remained standing by my table, a solitary uniformed island in the middle of the wreckage. And then, through the quiet chaos, something meaningful happened. An elderly man in a tailored tuxedo broke away from his table and walked toward me. I recognized him immediately. Retired General Mark Peterson, one of my father's oldest friends and a legend in his own right. He stopped before me, stood at attention, and rendered a crisp salute. "Well done, General Maddox," he said quietly, his voice filled with a respect that warmed me to my core. "Your father would be immensely proud." After him, a few other officers in the room, both active duty and retired, approached. There were no grand speeches, just firm handshakes, knowing nods, and eyes that conveyed a deep, shared understanding. They weren't just saluting a superior officer, they were acknowledging a fellow soldier who had just won a difficult personal war. In that moment, surrounded by that quiet solidarity, I felt a bond stronger than any blood tie. I didn't stay for the aftermath. I slipped out into the hotel lobby, the cool, quiet air a welcome relief. I was waiting for a taxi when my mother found me. The mask of the elegant Boston society hostess had shattered, leaving behind a raw, poorly concealed panic. "Elise, we need to talk," she began, her voice strained. "You've created a catastrophe. The press will get a hold of this. The family's reputation." "Your reputation," I corrected her, my voice flat and cold. "Not the family's." She flinched as if struck. "You have to do something," she insisted, her hands twisting the strap of her clutch. "Issue a statement, a clarification, say it was all a misunderstanding." I finally looked at her, really looked into the eyes that had judged me with disappointment my entire life. I remembered a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that I'd held on to. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I had finally stopped giving my consent. "There was no misunderstanding," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "There was only the truth, a truth that, apparently, neither of you could handle. From this point forward, do not contact me again. Unless it is a matter of life or death." Her mouth fell open. "You can't do that. I'm your mother." I let a beat of silence hang between us before I delivered the final painful truth. "You gave up that right a long time ago." Just as I was about to step outside, Ethan found me. He looked exhausted, the weight of the evening etched onto his face. "General, I am so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I was a coward. I knew how they treated you, but I stayed silent because I wanted an easy life." I simply listened, letting him unburden himself. "When you called me," he continued, "you reminded me of who I am, an officer, a soldier. And a soldier doesn't abandon his comrades, especially not the one who saved his life." He held out a small metal USB drive. "This is everything. The recordings of Claire's threatening phone calls, the emails she sent to her friends, mocking you. I found them on her laptop. I can't marry that person. I'm calling it off." I took the drive, its metallic shell cool in my palm. "Thank you, Ethan," I said. "You acted with honor today." The debt between us had been settled, not with currency, but with character. On the late-night flight back to Seattle, a strange sort of emptiness settled over me. It wasn't sadness precisely. It was the hollow, quiet feeling that comes after a long and brutal campaign. It was the relief of a great weight being lifted. I had won, but the victory meant acknowledging the final, irreparable fracture of what was supposed to be my family. I took out my phone, found my mother's contact, and pressed block. I did the same for Claire. It was a small, digital act, but it felt like building a steel wall. I stared out the window at the glittering lights of the cities below. Boston now just another pinprick of light, receding into the past. I had returned there as a rejected daughter, and I was leaving as a free woman. I hadn't come seeking reconciliation, and I hadn't found it. I had come seeking the truth, and sometimes the truth doesn't heal, it liberates. I no longer needed their approval to exist. I had my own respect. I had won the war, but the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of what was supposed to be my family. What, I wondered, do you build from the ashes? That question followed me home to Washington, a quiet companion in the days and weeks after the wedding that wasn't. The story of what happened at the Liberty Hotel spread through the military community, not as gossip, but as a kind of whispered legend. It wasn't reported in the mainstream press, but it traveled through a more potent network. Emails between veterans, conversations in VFW halls, and posts on private online forums for service members. And then the letters started to arrive. First a trickle, then a flood. They came from soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines across the country. A young sergeant whose family disowned him for enlisting instead of taking over the family business. A female captain whose husband cheated on her during her deployment and then accused her of being too damaged by her service. A major whose own brother sabotaged his security clearance out of jealousy. Each story was a different battle, but the war was the same. It was the war against being betrayed by the very people who were supposed to be your safe harbor. Reading their letters, I saw my own pain reflected in their words. I realized I wasn't alone in my fight. This wound was deeper and wider than I had ever imagined, a quiet epidemic of heartbreak within a community sworn to protect. And in their pain, I found a strange kind of healing. My own story began to feel less like a personal tragedy and more like a shared testament. I knew then what I had to build from the ashes. I couldn't just sit on the sidelines. With legal guidance from David Chen and the organizational genius of a now retired Master Sergeant Grant, I used a portion of my life's savings to establish the Maddox Resilience Foundation. Our mission was simple but profound: to provide legal aid, psychological support, and a robust peer network for service members whose careers and well-being were threatened by personal betrayal. We weren't a charity, we were a support unit for a different kind of front line, the invisible battlefield of the heart and mind. Pouring my energy into the foundation was the most meaningful work I had ever done. It felt more significant than earning another star for my shoulder. I was taking the deepest scar of my life and turning it into a lighthouse for others lost in the same storm. The foundation quickly gained traction. 6 months later, I was invited to give a TEDx talk in Seattle. I stood on the iconic red circular rug, not in my uniform, but in a simple navy blue blazer and slacks. I felt more exposed and yet more powerful than I ever had in my Class A's. I told my story, not the salacious details of the wedding, but the story of resilience. Family is not always the home we are born into, I began, my voice steady. Sometimes it's the harbor we find in a storm. Loyalty, I continued, is not defined by bloodline. It's defined by action. It's in the quiet support, the unwavering respect, and the courage to stand for someone's honor when they are not in the room. I spoke of the letters, of the shared pain of a community. We train our soldiers to survive the hell of war, I concluded, my eyes sweeping across the audience. It is time we build a system to help them survive the challenges of coming home. The room rose to its feet in a standing ovation. It wasn't applause for a general. It was for a survivor who had finally found her true voice. A year later, the story ends. I retired from the Army, my service complete. I am no longer Lieutenant General Maddox. I am just Elise. I bought a small rustic house, made of cedar and glass, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific in Big Sur, California. Every morning I walk along the foggy beach, letting the cool waves wash over my feet and the salt-laced wind carry away the last vestiges of old ghosts. The foundation thrives, run by a dedicated board of directors I trust completely. I still receive letters of thanks, which I read on my deck, while sipping my morning coffee. I have no contact with my mother or Claire. I heard through the grapevine that Ethan did, in fact, call off the wedding, and has since transferred to a new post overseas. I feel no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. I just feel peace. One afternoon, as I was painting on my porch, the vast expanse of the ocean, my only subject, an email pinged on my phone. It was from Grant. The president would like to appoint you to a new commission on military cultural reform, he wrote. I smiled to myself. A few years ago, that would have been the pinnacle of my ambition. I thought of a Maya Angelou quote that had become my guide. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. The foundation was making people feel seen. That was my new mission. I archived the email and returned to my canvas, dabbing a streak of cerulean blue onto the horizon. I had fought enough battles. Now it was time to live. I looked out at the endless ocean where the sea and sky met in a soft, hazy line. I had walked a long road alone, but I was, at last, no longer lost. My story might be over, but I know that for many of you, your own story of resilience is still being written. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't on the battlefield, but in realizing that our worth is not determined by the family we are born into, but by the honor with which we live our own lives. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen or underestimated, know that you are not alone. Thank you for walking this road with me. For more true stories that empower and inspire, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more voices like mine to light.